Started. My name is Kim Crable. I'm one of the two community liaisons here at Hospice of Southern Maine. Thank you so much for joining us for Ask the Experts today. My guest is Barbara Karnes, and she's joining us from the West Coast, so it's a little earlier for her there. But I think most of you who've signed up for this are very familiar with Barbara. If it has to do with death and dying, Barbara Karnes, RN, is talking about it. Her articles have been featured in the New York Times, USA Today, the Huffington Post, Thrive Global, and Washington Post, among others. She was awarded the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization Innovator Award for her decades as an end-of-life educator and for her iconic booklet, Gone From My Sight, The Dying Experience. And we're going to be talking about that a lot today. Barbara's career spans 4 decades and began as an early hospice pioneer during the AIDS crisis. In addition to the many years she spent at the bedside caring for patients and their families as a nurse, Barbara has also served as executive director of hospices and various home health agencies. She's also worked through the hospice ranks as patient care manager, clinical director, staff, nurse, and volunteer. She's a dedicated end-of-life educator, and we're so happy to have her here today. Thank you so much, Barbara.
Oh, hey, I'm excited to be here.
Good. So, to help families understand the stages of death that the body goes through and the spirit goes through as you pass, I know that the last time we talked, you said that was the impetus for working at bedside with all these hospice patients, that you wrote Gone From My Sight. And today is the first day of National Hospice and Palliative Care Month, and we thought it would be wonderful to have you on to help us go through your booklet and just talk about the stages of death and how this will help families. And I know since the last time we spoke, when I talked to you before, I was obviously familiar with working with hospice, with your little blue book of hospice. But since we've spoken, my father passed on hospice, and it was so helpful to my family and especially my mother to have your book right at the ready so we could refer. My mom would pick up your book and say, I think he's here. And it just helped so much understanding and, doing the things that the exact reason you created this, to create the feeling of, to educate people so they understand that this is a normal thing. Don't call 911. They want to be at home. You can do this. And it was very much you can do this. You can get through this. So I really appreciate it so much that you did this, and appreciate it in a totally different way than I did when I was talking with you about this before. So thank you for that. And I know that you've been through your own hardship this year, and I want to offer condolences from all of us here to you. But I was hoping that we could just start out, and in your book, you start out at the 1 to 3 months prior to death. And can you just talk a little bit about how this booklet can be helpful and what that stage looks like for people when they're going through this?
I sure can. Let's start with saying that people don't die like they do in the movies, but that's our only role models, really, because people used to live at home and die at home, and that's not really the case anymore. So we don't have any idea of what dying is about. And so I wrote Gone From My Sight as a guide for families. And it starts out 2 to 3 to 4 months before death from disease or old age. Someone who's just old is going to go through the same signs. It's just going to take them longer. And so when I talk about signs of approaching death that occurs months before death from disease, you can see these same signs for years in someone who's just old with no disease process. The same when it comes down to the changes that say a person has weeks to live, then whether you're old or have a disease, we all die the same. And so then the same signs kicked in. So 2, 3, 4 months before death from disease, 3 things are going to start happening. One is the person's eating habits are going to change. Months before death, they're probably going to stop eating meat. And then pretty soon on this continuum, it will be fruits and vegetables, then anything that requires energy to digest. And then they're going to reach a point where you're doing good if you can get Ensure Plus. Ice cream. Oh, we love our ice cream. Ice cream goes a long way. And then we're going to get to a place where we're doing good if we can get sips of water or Gatorade down. And that's how it's supposed to be. But coming off of being a caregiver in the last few months, I know how hard it is as a caregiver to not feed our special person. I realized that I was concentrating on keeping my husband alive, and that was through food, while his body and he was concentrating on dying. And so it created a tension between us. Food is a key part in approaching end of life. The other thing is sleeping habits change. Again, 2, 3, 4 months before death, a person will start taking an afternoon nap. And then on this continuum, it's a morning and an afternoon nap. And then they're asleep all evening in front of the TV. You wake them up, you put them to bed, they sleep all night. And then one day they don't get out of bed and they're asleep more than they're awake. The third thing is socialization. And it's, again, 2, 3, 4 months before death, a person starts with not being interested in their favorite football team or not being interested in all those things that they were interested in when they were healthy. So they start withdrawing and they don't watch the football game. And then one day they'll say to you, don't have the neighbor ladies come over. I'm too tired. And then don't have the grandkids come over because I'm too tired. And then they're gradually asleep more than they're awake. And that's how it's supposed to be. In the weeks, 2, 3, 4, well, let's go 1 to 3 weeks before a person dies, there are significant changes. I call it labor because we go through labor to get into this world and we go through labor to leave it. And it isn't, like I said, seeing Judi Dench suddenly say something profound and then she's dead, which is what we expect to happen, is in the 1 to 3 weeks. You walk into a room. The key thing is they start sleeping with their eyes partially open, maybe one eye open, one eye closed, eyelids at half mask. And you look at them and they stop breathing. And you think, oh my gosh, he's dead. And then he starts breathing again. I call it start and stop breathing. You'll also see random hand movements where they're picking at the air or picking at their bedclothes, just random, not making any sense. That says labor has begun. Now, there's new changes that occur that tell us a person has days to hours. Most people are non-responsive in the days to hours before they die. They're not carrying on a conversation and 10 minutes later they're dead. So they're non-responsive. Their breathing changes. And now from going to probably fast breathing or start and stop breathing, their breaths get slower and slower and slower until they're breathing maybe 5 or 6 breaths a minute. And then something now remember, they're non-responsive. They can hear, but they can't respond. Now, what interesting happens, and this is the scary part, this is the Friday the 13th part. In the minutes before death, a person's facial expression is probably going to change. And what you'll see is it's almost like a frown, a grimace, almost like sometimes a silent scream. It's like, no, I don't want to leave that which I know. Following this movement, there will be 1 or 2 or 3 long spaced out breaths. You think they're not going to take another breath, and they do. Those are all the signs that lead up to death. And remember, someone who's just old will have the months, years before death. But when labor begins, 1 to 3 weeks, we all die the same. Even fast death, if you are in a car accident and the person is dying on the scene, then you'll probably see the facial expression, the head movement. So this is just our tools. Some people will do absolutely everything that I've just outlined. Excuse me.
Yes.
Other people will do none of it.
Mm-hmm.
Most people will do at least some.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's gone from my side.
That's great.
Should I just go on?
Well, no, I wanted to just talk with you about that for a minute, and hope that you recover from your cough. It is interesting when you talk about, people losing their appetite, and, the way that in a home, usually the way you show your love is you cook and you bake and you bring out, their favorite things. And that's when, it's very intense because you're trying to give care. Like you said, they're pulling back naturally from that because their body is telling them they shouldn't be eating. But it is interesting the way you describe what they give up first, what you tend to see. And do you think it's because animal, meats and things take longer or are more difficult to digest? Is that the theory that goes along that you give up? Because ice cream seems like it's really easy to digest. I know I can eat a lot of it, but is that like the theory that your body is kind of telling your brain what you need and don't?
Yes, I think it takes energy, your body energy to digest meat longer, more work than it does to digest soft foods. And they go from meat, no meat, or not wanting to eat meat, fruits and vegetables. And you'd think fruits and vegetables wouldn't be the second category. You'd think that you could get those down longer, but you can't. Soft foods, baby food, pureed food, soups, that works. And then ensure ice cream through this whole thing. In the months before death, when eating becomes an issue, what I recommend is Ensure Plus, Boost, 350 calories per can, per 8 ounces, and give that 3 or 4 times a day. That gets you up to over 1,000 calories. It's not really enough for an average body, but for a body that's is being really active, that can buy a little time. And then with I would say 4 cans of Boost or Ensure Plus, with that, offer little snacks. They're not going to eat a meal, but offer a snack, maybe a high protein snack, maybe some cheese and crackers, or maybe some cottage cheese, or custards and puddings, and you offer those several times a day also, in addition, but not at the same time that you're giving them the boost. All you're trying to do is buy time. And
Mhm.
at some point, it's not going to work. And
Mhm.
that's the hard part. That's the hard part for the caregiver. And that's often where tension develops between the patient and the caregiver. As I said, one's trying to keep them alive, the other's trying to die.
Yeah, let's talk about the caregiver and how difficult that is. You know, we understand with hospice, a lot of people think that hospice is a 24/7 service, that we come in and, stay at the patient's home, which of course we don't. You know, our IDT, our care team touches down and visits for maybe 45 minutes here, an hour there. You might have a volunteer come in for a couple hours one day, but you don't have that continual care, except for by the caregiver, who might be family, friend, whomever. And that takes a big toll. It takes a big toll because the dying process, you start at 3 months, 1 to 3 months. It's a long process, and it's very hard to watch someone you love pass away. It's just a deep and difficult thing. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit about some things that you've done and ways that we can support the caregiver, both with your educational pieces, as well as anything else that you've seen in your years in the field that is really helpful. Because as hospice, I know that you talk about hospices, 90% of our role is education. So that is a big part of what we're doing, is this education. But, I would love to hear what some resources are that you find are really helpful as caregivers are going through this difficult time.
Support's a big thing, and that's where your hospice volunteers come in that hospice volunteer, and maybe a couple of them, their job is to become the caregiver's best friend, that person that they can sit down and say anything to, because they're not going to the caregiver isn't going to say to their kids, whether they're adult or not, I can't do this, I'm mad at him, I'm tired. But they can say that to a stranger. And that's the volunteer's job, is to become that listener and then report back to the hospice team these dynamics that are going on. I think for the caregiver, sleep becomes a big issue because the caregiver is tired all the time, not just from all the physical work that they're doing, but the emotional burden that they're carrying. And so the other aspect of the volunteers is come in and, Mary, you go lay down and you take a 2-3 hour nap and you rest while I'm here and I'll hold down the fort. Because a caregiver, it isn't like you put your guy to bed at 9 o'clock at night and you can do anything you want and sleep, stay up and watch TV, and then at 10 o'clock go to bed and sleep till 7, because you're going to be up during the night also. And so sleep is vital for the caregiver.
That is so true. That was one of the most difficult things when my dad was with us, was just, he was up at all hours, and it was just exhausting. It's emotionally exhausting. It's physically exhausting. And yeah, that's a really good point. And I hadn't really thought about the volunteers just being there while the caregiver went and took a nap. It didn't even occur to me for some reason, but that's a really good use of a volunteer's time. Give the caregiver a break.
Absolutely. If the caregiver has family or friends that they can pull on and get support, that's wonderful. But a lot of people don't have that.
Mhm.
A lot of people, it's the patient and their caregiver, and that's it. And so the what would be wonderful is if we could have hired caregivers, but most people can't.
Mhm.
And so that's where hospice can really provide support, not only the knowledge, but the home health aid
Mhm.
for the bathing, really big, really important. And oftentimes the patient and family, particularly the patient in the months before death, is more open and talkative with the home health aide
Mhm.
than he or she is with their family or with the hospice nurse or social worker. There's something about someone who sees you naked that you can
Yeah.
talk more openly with. So
Mhm.
the home health aide is a very vital role in end of life care and support.
Mhm. For sure. So what are some other valuable resources that you feel would be helpful for families?
Just since you ask, I just happen to have um, the booklet, The 11th Hour. Gone from My Sight tells the family what's going to happen. Here's what you're going to see. The 11th Hour says, here's what you do while it's happening. And so they go together in my mind. They go into the initial family packet in my mind. And if you put it in the initial family packet, you've got to bring that admission nurse, the primary care nurse has to bring this out and read it with the
Mhm.
caregiver,
Mhm.
because I get constantly, oh, Dad died and I was going through the packet hospice gave me and
Mhm.
I found this booklet. I
Mhm.
wish I had had it sooner,
Mhm.
because they're not going to, on admission, you get all these paperwork, all this forms, all this stuff, and the caregiver's overwhelmed and they're not going to go through it as much as we want them to. They're not going to. So it's up to the hospice nurse to sit down and say, let's read this together. And then you can say, oh, I think Dad's right here,
Mhm.
and talk about it.
Mhm.
So you pull this out and you say, I want you to read this. And the next time I come, we're going to talk about it. That ensures you get it read. And this is a guide from eating, sleeping, up to the moment of death, for the caregiver, for the family, what they can do. So what we have to remember is the moment of death is our goal. That's the goal. We go in there, everything we do leads up to the moment of death. And then our work starts to decline following the death in our bereavement program, et cetera. But the moment of death is our goal and all that we work toward to make this a sacred experience for the family. And that's educating them, because that neutralizes the fear that all of us bring when someone we care about is dying, or don't care about is dying. So we want to create this sacred experience so that they will carry that sacred memory with them
Mhm.
forever.
Mhm.
And that is guiding, supporting, and educating. And since hospice isn't there, my goal when I was in hospice was to be with the patient and family at the moment of death. That was our goal.
Mhm.
Today, not so much. It doesn't happen. And so you don't want to leave them unprepared.
Mhm.
And this gives them ideas of what they can do.
That's great. I know that we give out Gone From My Sight in every packet when people come on service. The 11th hour, I know we have some here. I'm not sure that's provided, but I know that the hospice team does have availability of that. I know of some hospices that aren't giving out your little blue book that I just feel is not, understanding how helpful it was. There was nothing else in the packet that hospice gave that was that helpful. So I can't imagine if you're eliminating something from the packet, why that would go. But I'm really proud that we still support people with that because it's really very helpful. So I have some questions that were submitted I know we're about halfway through. I've got some questions and there will probably be some in chat, but I'm going to go through the questions that people submitted first.
Can you wait? Can you
Yes.
wait?
Oh, yes, of course.
Because I want to say two things about these, because a lot of people don't in end of life don't know about this. Pain at end of life. It's a booklet that addresses pain. I can't tell you how many emails I get weekly from people that say hospice killed my mom. And it happens because they don't understand narcotic use. And so I wrote this as a guide to help families understand. So if pain, not everyone has pain at end of life. Dying is not painful. Disease causes pain. And so if a person has a history of pain, then you want to educate the family in narcotic use and pain management so that when dad dies, hospice isn't, the caregiver isn't going to write me a letter and say hospice killed him. The other thing is we're taking on more and more patients with dementia. And dementia doesn't play by the rules. People who are diagnosed, who are entering end of life, the only thing you're going to look for is when a person stops eating, when they can't swallow, when they're choking, because the other three parts of signs of approaching death don't count. With someone with dementia, they can sleep 24/7 for years.
Yes.
Someone who has dementia can be withdrawn and literally live in another world for years. It isn't until they can't eat, when they can't take in enough calories for maintenance, then you look at hospice. That's when it is appropriate, because then you can determine kind of how long a person has to live. So I wrote this for families to understand. So these two books.
What is the name of that? I can't really see the name of the purple one because of the writing.
How Do I Know You?
How do I know? Okay.
Do I Know You? And so you have these in your supply closet. And if you've got a family and a patient with dementia, then you're going to read this with them. If you have someone who you're dealing with pain and pain management, you're going to read this with them. You don't even have to give it to them if money's an issue, but have it in your toolkit. All your nurses should have these in their toolkit so that they can guide the family when those two issues come up. Okay, now I wanted to throw that in.
No, I appreciate that. That's great, because their toolkits, I will check and make sure they do have those in their toolkits. And at the end, we will send out your BK Books link to everyone. So if anyone's interested in going on and purchasing something for themselves, because I know your booklets are really reasonably priced. And, if I would like to share that with people in case they'd like something for their home library, because I know that people love Gone From My Sight and tend to keep that for a very long time and use it and refer to it when they're going through that. So So yeah, so we've got some questions here, and I know that you've been really open and like, I will answer any questions. So I'm going to give you some. There are a couple in here that are interesting, but I think that you can handle them. And I'm not sure who these have come from. So when I say how can we, this question is how can we help our patients and loved ones view and understand death as part of living? So that might be someone who works for hospice. It might be one of our referral partners. It might be someone in a facility.
Okay, so the question is, how can we help people
Understand that death is part of living, and I guess not be so afraid of it and consider it something totally different than part of life? That's a big question.
It's a really hard question because our society is set up that we don't even talk about dying. We don't get our advance directives because if I get an advance directive, it might mean that I'm going to die. So we're such a death-denying society that it's really hard to get people's attention to learn about end of life until they need to.
Mhm.
And they don't necessarily know they need to in a timely manner because they don't have the role models. So I think that hospice's job is not only taking care of people who are dying, but to educate the community. Go to senior citizen communities, go to assisted living, go to church groups and talk end of life. Your credential is that I'm a hospice administrator, I'm a hospice social worker, I'm a hospice chaplain, I'm a hospice nurse. That's your credential, but you're talking end of life so that you can neutralize the fear that all of us carry. And I think once that's as much a part of hospice's responsibility, the community education, as it is taking care of the patients and families themselves, because very few people write to me and say, I'm not dying, my family's fine, everything's wonderful, but I know you're an educator and I want to know about end of life.
Mhm.
Doesn't happen very much.
Yeah.
I get it when the physician, which I hope does, says, I can't fix you. Then that's when I then get people contacting me. The other aspect is educate your physicians so that they know when to call in hospice, that they appreciate that families and patients need to know when treatment isn't working anymore. You know, our medical establishment, I'm going out on a limb here, our medical establishment treats diseases that people have. Hospice and end-of-life doulas, the end-of-life community treats people that happen to have diseases. What I would think is imperative, and I don't know how to get it done, is that in medical school, we teach end of life, not how to fix it, but how to provide comfort care, comfort management, and the courage to say to a patient, you know, we've given it our best shot, done everything we can do, and it's not working. Let's talk comfort care. The physician is at the top of the pyramid. Everything comes down from that physician. We need to educate our physicians. And since medical schools aren't doing a really good job of it, then hospice and end-of-life doulas need to get out there and educate their physicians. Go on ground rounds. Do whatever you can to educate your physicians.
We have some really good programs at Hospice of Southern Maine where residents come over and spend a week or 2 weeks with us and, you know, do rounds at our hospice inpatient house and come and work with home patients. And I just worked with someone today who's going to be a psychiatrist, but she said, you know what, this is just, she just said, I had no idea, like my eyes were open to this. So it is, I think that that is invaluable education. It's hard to get to physicians. They're very busy, but we always try, and we do a lot of community education here, but we're trying to figure out how to be a little more creative around it, because if we put up the typical Hospice 101 or let's talk about hospice presentation, we don't get a lot of people who sign up. So we try to figure out how we can be creative and have that conversation so they're familiar with it when the time comes, but maybe have a different, you know, maybe do an advanced care planning session and then talk about hospice as part of something they might want to think about. Because one thing that I know that you probably heard a lot, and we hear a lot, is that after someone has passed, people say, I wish I'd known about hospice sooner. And it breaks everyone's heart because we wish we were there sooner too. And how do we reach these people and reach the physicians as well, saying that we are an option earlier in the process? So yeah, one of our big goals is education. So I agree. If we do more education and people understand this is in the continuum of healthcare, hospice is part of that. It's expert medical care. Then hopefully we can get more people wanting to understand it before it's too late to really give them all the magic that is hospice. Okay, here's my second question, and I'm not sure if you have an answer for this, but what was the longest amount of time you worked with a patient who was in hospice? Because I know that, you know, we think about it's a 6-month prognosis, but many, many people stay with hospice much longer than that.
One of my very favorite patients, and remind me to talk about hospice nurses and employees taking care of themselves. I need to talk about that.
Okay.
Most of the patients that I took care of as children of God. And Barbara took care of them, and there wasn't an emotional connection. I can tell you, we'll do about this number of patients that got into Barbara's heart. And every once in a while, a patient or caregiver will get into your heart. And the longest patient that I took care of was Charles. Charles got into my heart. He was the father I never had, and I still have a place for him in my heart. If all of my patients got that deep in my heart, I'd have been selling dresses at Macy's. You know, I would not have been able to stay in this job. And so most of our patients, and I deviated as far as from the actual time that the question you asked, most of the time, people don't refer hospice soon enough. Now, they are afraid to call them in too soon because that says they're going to die, and I don't want to deal with that. The problem I see with long-term patients, what I see in the last few years is hospice is taking on more and more patients with dementia as the only disease process. And as I mentioned, you can look like you're dying and have dementia for years. It isn't until you're not eating that you can really put a time frame on dementia. And so I see that as the challenge that a lot of hospices are having throughout the country, is they're bringing patients on with dementia and then they don't die and they don't die and they don't die. And their certification time is up. And then the question is, do we keep them or not? And way too often it's no, we can't keep them. And it's because, going out on another limb here, it's because sometimes hospice is more interested in getting the referral than they are at really looking at dementia and where that is. And so you've got to be really, really careful about admitting someone whose only diagnosis is dementia.
There was a front page story in the local paper about a patient who had been on hospice for years and had dementia and unfortunately couldn't be recertified. And it was just a heartbreaking story for everyone because the caregiver, her husband, had been really used to that support and didn't have anyone else, didn't have children or anything, which almost, I'm sure it helped him along the way, but it was just a heartbreaking ending that there was no help and they had to release her from hospice. And and that is, we are having another Ask the Experts in January where Fernando Moreno, who's our medical director, is going to talk about dementia and Alzheimer's, because we do get a lot of questions about that as well. When is someone appropriate? And it is a very tight list of how you get someone certified to be paid for it. That kind of is shocking to some people because, like you said, it's not, dementia by itself isn't the diagnosis. It has to be certain changes that you're seeing, and they have to be pretty drastic, but people need help because, there's other resources, but it's not necessarily hospice at that point.
Well, and our medical system is really at default here because there is, think about on a national level, the number of patients and families living with dementia. And what they really need is shift work. Yes. And most people can't afford shift work. And that's what someone with a family with dementia needs. Someone that can come in and help, not just the 45 minutes that the hospice nurse or home health aide comes in. They need day-to-day long-term care. And our healthcare system has a void in it and a flaw. And I don't know if they'll get that fixed or not.
I agree. Okay, I see we're kind of using a lot of time, so we'll go a little bit, maybe a little more rapid answer for these. What would be the best advice you could give a hospice volunteer?
I started out as a hospice volunteer. I was a hospice volunteer for 4 months. And what they didn't know is I'd have paid them to work for them. But, it is such fulfilling work to be that hospice volunteer. Not everyone can work with end of life. And so it's really up to the volunteer coordinator and the orientation and the education that you give that volunteer is going to, what you give them is going to depend upon how long they'll work for you. And they are a vital source in hospice. I've got all kinds of ideas that could be used and aren't, but the volunteer first, and this is our job as hospice also, needs to understand why they're drawn to hospice. Why do they want to be a volunteer for hospice? Is it because hospice took care of Dad and it was so wonderful, I now want to give back? That's great, but you can't give back for a year. You really need to be away from the emotional involvement of your loved one dying
Mhm.
before you can begin helping other people during that time. So I think the criteria of why do you want to do this work and what is your relationship with dying, your volunteer education is crucial.
Mhm.
Is crucial, and that's on the hospice shoulders.
Mhm. We have a nice new program that you may have seen for our volunteers. We haven't quite rolled it out yet, but our volunteers can use it with patients. And it's a VR headset where the patients can do things like a 10-minute swim with the dolphins, or hike the Grand Canyon if they're more adventurous, or travel back to their hometown with Google Streetwise and kind of walk through their hometown or be guided by a volunteer, which I think is fantastic because our volunteers do everything, but this just, once a patient becomes a little more homebound, I think it's just a fantastic opportunity to allow people just the joy of seeing something outside their four walls or experiencing something maybe on their bucket list that they never got to see. And that VR experience is so real. It's just amazing. Have you seen those systems?
I have heard about them. I have not been up close and personal, but I have heard about them, and I think they're incredibly wonderful.
Yeah. If you ever come to Maine, you need to stop by and we'll show you ours. How's that? I think this is from someone in hospice. How do you prepare yourself? And you talked a little bit about this. How do you prepare yourself for the inevitable death of your client? Like, you obviously had some clients that you got closer to or felt close to, but I guess in the wide spectrum, like, is there anything you feel people
Well,
can do?
when you use the word client, that sounds to me like it's someone who works in hospice or is involved in end of life, because as a caregiver, you wouldn't say client.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
So it sounds like it's someone who works in end of life. If you work in end of life, you really need to be there because you want to be there and do this work. It isn't like working in a hospital and you get moved from floor to floor. This takes a special healthcare worker, whether it's social worker, chaplain, nurse, doctor, home health aide. It takes a special person to do this work because it goes against everything our medical training has taught us. And so if you're doing this work, it needs to be really a heart choice. And I've had nurses that I've said, you know what, you really need to be in home health because you're concentrating on the medical aspects. And that's a part of end of life care, but it's just a part.
Mhm.
It's the emotional, it's the social, it's the spiritual. You have to treat the whole patient, not just the physical. And our medical establishment really teaches what to do with the physical. And so when we in hospice hire people, us staff, that's the key that we look for, because we can teach any healthcare worker how to provide the care. We can teach that, but we can't teach the empathy and the emotional component that's needed in end of life work, because you're kind of like a psychologist as well as a nurse. You're working with the whole person. And since we're talking about that, I want to say
Mhm.
I wrote a booklet for those employees that work in hospice, because it takes, as I said, the emotional component of I want to do this. You have to understand why you want to do it. And this is also good for volunteers. And I've got time. I'll talk real quick and say that I got into this work because I have a belief that I can work with end of life. And 1 year after I was working in hospice as a nurse, I was facilitating a grief group, and I'm the one that fell in a little heap on the floor and kept crying and saying, there are so many ghosts. And what I realized is that I had no closure for every one of the deaths that I had been involved with, that I just, stuffed that experience in my pocket and then moved on to the next family. Mm-hmm. And that taught me to create a ritual with the death of each patient that I had. A journal where you write the date, the patient's name, and a couple of sentences about that patient, and have that as your journal. Or you go home at night and you've got a little space in your house where you have a candle, and you light the candle and you talk to that person and say, thank you for coming into my life, and say a few words and then blow out the candle. Be creative. Mm-hmm. Come up with a ritual with the death of each one of your patients, because then you can go on mm-hmm. to the next.
I love that so much, Barbara. That mm-hmm. is so, it's just a sweet way to honor people that you work with. And it just shows this job is not like any other. What other job would you do that? But that just is really heartfelt and so sweet. What is the best way to help a patient who's having visions when dying?
So many do. They're a window into the other world. You don't really have to help them. You're there, you're with them. They're a window into the other world, and they're telling us what the other world is like. We don't have to fix it. If the person is aggressive, if they're so restless that you're afraid they're going to hurt themselves or fall out of bed or whatever, then you get the Haldol or the Ativan. But just having visions, listen to them. They're mm-hmm. teaching you. And I can tell you a ton of stories of what I've learned about the other world just from listening.
Mm-hmm. I would like to talk with you again about that. That sounds fascinating.
We'll do that next time.
Okay, that sounds great. I've got some other questions that people have submitted, but because anonymous attendee asked a question here, I want to ask you, how can we get the medical community, especially, to stop treating death as a failure?
I wish I had the answer. I had a magic wand. I think it has to start in the medical schools.
Yeah.
I think you have to teach physicians that there is a time to stop, mm-hmm. and that it's not a failure if you say, we've done all that we can do. Mm-hmm. And yet that's so uncomfortable mm-hmm. for physicians or any of us that are outside of the end of life arena, mm-hmm. because death is viewed as a failure. Mm-hmm. It used to be, I've got 1 minute and I'm going to talk real fast. Mm-hmm. It used to be that grandma lived at home, mm-hmm. and grandma got sick. She died in the upstairs bedroom, and we learned how to die, and we learned how to grieve. And then when the medical became more prominent, then a person went to the hospital if they were sick. And there they died, and generally they were alone at the room at the end of the hall. And then from people dying at hospitals, then we moved to people dying in nursing facilities because family, it isn't necessarily there as a caregiver. And again, no one really knew that what their loved one experienced when they died. And nursing facilities, their Medicare regs concentrate on keeping everyone alive. And so they don't know about dying either. Today, we're coming full circle. Hospice, thank you, has brought dying at home back into the picture. That's where it should be, surrounded by love and support, and the dog and the cat. That's, where we want to die. We don't want to die in these other places. And so we're coming back. We're coming back.
Maine has done really well. Like 20 years ago, this is actually in 2024, Hospice of Southern Maine celebrates our 20th anniversary. And when we first came into being in 2004, we were tied, out of all the states, we were tied for last with Alaska, with the number of people who were eligible for hospice, who actually took advantage of the hospice benefit. And now, this past year, we're number 9, which is so good. And of course, our goal is to be number 1. But we know Maine's a little rural in some places, and it might be a little tough, but we've come a long way. And it's because we take to heart what you say, is that education is really how you're going to at least discuss this with people, to get them to be aware of it, because there's so many things that compete for our attention, right? And most people don't want to think about death because that will happen when it happens, and we'll think about that down the road. But if we can get this in front of people and offer them some good information, I think it's doing the best we can do, so that they know when the time comes, there is some support and they don't have to go it alone.
Yep, absolutely. I'm with you.
So I really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. I know there's some questions that we didn't get to, but last time I sent you the questions and you were nice enough to type out some answers. So I'll do that as well, and we can share those with the people who joined us. And if there are any other questions that anyone has, we have our askhospiceexperts.org website that you can go in and type a question into, and also see Barbara, who spoke with us last year. We have a nice recording of that conversation. We'll add this to the library. And I really, again, appreciate your time and all you're doing for the community. And I appreciate all the resources that you bring to bear, because like I said, it was really meaningful to me and my family this year. So thank you so much, Barbara.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And, anytime I can help you, because you guys are doing a great, great job. You're above and beyond, and I want to support that. So don't hesitate to call me. Look at the blog, have your people sign up for the blog.
Okay. I'll send that out as a link as well.
Okay, good. And thank you, and bless you all.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you all for joining us today.